Hi, my name is Grady Pruitt from GradyPruitt.com, and today we're going to do a tutorial on how to do a stripe texture procedurally in Blender. So why would you want to do a stripe texture? Well, this shirt that I'm wearing might look familiar. If you saw at the beginning of this video, I had my self-portrait character, and on that character he was wearing a shirt that was based off of this shirt that I'm wearing right now. Looking through my closet, I saw that I had a number of other striped shirts. I also remember seeing stripes on suits, ties, pants, socks, all sorts of clothing items. But in addition to clothing, you also find stripes on towels, sheets, bedspreads, pillows, and even beyond that, you can find stripes on walls, sofas, chairs, cups, dishes, any sort of thing, any object that you can come up with could potentially be a place where you might want to use a stripe texture. So I got to thinking about doing a stripe texture, and I wondered what would be some of the disadvantages of doing it as a image texture. And while it's perfectly fine to use an image program such as GIMP, Krita, Photoshop, whatever image editing program you like, while it's perfectly fine to use an image editing program to create a stripe pattern, some of the problems you run into with, first of all, if you make the image too small and try to scale it up, you could run into some pixelation issues, particularly if you're trying to scale it across a large area. Another problem that you could wind up with is if you're if you make your image too large, you could wind up using a large amount of resources that could be reserved for other things. But another one of the problems with using another program to create a stripe pattern is if, say, you have a really complex pattern and say you decide that you want to make a change, then you have to go back to your image editing program, open up the file that you want to make the change in. You have to make your change, resave it into an image format that Blender can use, and then you have to go back into Blender, reload the image, and all this takes time. Whereas if you could do it from within Blender, then you could do it much faster. So that's why you might want to do a stripe texture. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through what I learned in trying to create a stripe texture and how you can apply that to whatever object you want to do. So let's hop on over into Blender and get started with this tutorial.
Okay, now that we're in Blender, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. Now, before we get started, I just want to point out a few things here real quick. I've already set up a few things. In the world setting, I already have an environment texture set up. In the scene, you'll see that I already have a camera and a light. The camera already has its settings set up for to light the scene. I've also modeled and imported a shirt that I have modeled and sculpted. I'm not. This is just an object to use to show the technique. You can use whatever object you want. If you're wondering how I modeled this shirt, I found the basics for how to do the modeling of the shirt, basically through doing the intro to character modeling course on Blender on CG Cookie. So if you want to know how to do that, that's where you can find that. And if you're not a CG Cookie Citizen member, I would highly recommend it because it is worth it, I think, for the amount of training that you get and the quality of training that you get. So one other thing uh, with the shirt is that I have it set. I have done seams on it. Uh, this isn't necessary for setting up a seams and unwrapping. Isn't necessary for every object that you come across. You can do that. You can use this without doing it. For something like a shirt or uh, uh, for something like a shirt or a what am I trying to think of here? A pair of pants or something like that. Um, like an article of clothing, it can actually be helpful to do the seams, even if you don't have them, even if you don't model the seams. You probably will have some sort of seams modeled anyway, but or at least sculpted in, but it'll help with the realism of the shirt. Uh, if you just place the seams and you just place the seams normally where you would find them. For example, with this shirt, we've got one across the shoulder, one that goes around the arm here to separate the arm, to separate the sleeve. We've got one that goes from the bottom of the sleeve up through where the seam where it separates and then down the side of the shirt. And it's like that on both sides. And for this particular model, I have the collar separated, and actually with the collar I have that as its own material. You can use the same material for the collar. For some shirts, like a dress shirt, you might actually see that used where it's the same striping pattern, but on other shirts like a polo shirt, uh, you might find that your collar is just a solid color while the rest of the shirt is a print. And sometimes in those cases you could even do like a little bit of a cuff here on the shirt where it matches the color. So just some things to be aware of. I've also, as I mentioned, UV unwrapped this shirt, and we'll be using that here in just a minute. So let's take a look at the rendered view of our shirt and come over to our node editor. And as you can see in the node editor, I already have a few shaders already set up here. We have this isn't you can use whatever shader setup you want. This is just what I have set up for the shirt. I have a diffuse and a glossy that are connected into a mix shader, and that's being controlled by a Fresnel. And if you're wondering where this Fresnel comes from, if you watch any of Kent Trammell's Shader Forge tutorials, then that's one that he uses a lot in those. So you can find out how he does that there. I believe he even shows how to create that node in the Hobo tutorial, if I remember right. And let's see. So that's the Fresnel node is just controlling how the how much influence the glossy has. And then I also have that result being fed into another mix shader, which is adding a velvety effect, which is also being controlled by Fresnel. I also have a bump texture setup. In this particular setup for a bump texture, I've learned from another character modeling course. This one was the 2010 Intro to that's not the one. This one here. Sorry, the 2010 Blender training series, Intro to Character Modeling. That's the one that he did for with that Jonathan Williamson did for the Kara. So if you're familiar with that one, that's where that one comes from. And as you can see, this one is free, so it's in the archives if you are interested in how I put together that node setup and what it does. But that's just specific to this shirt. You can actually use whatever you want for textures. What we're really interested in today is how to create the striping pattern. So whenever I first did the striping pattern for my shirt, the first thing I thought to use was the wave texture, because whenever you do a wave texture, it creates these nice little bands. You could use bands or rings. I don't think it really makes much of a difference. It might make a little bit of a difference depending on the object that you have. But as you can see, this doesn't quite look right on the shirt. And part of why it doesn't quite look right is when you come across a seam, you might have little variations in the pattern on the striping. So that's one reason why for a shirt this might not necessarily work. If you were doing another object like a torus, for example, you might get away with using the generated, and that's one of the reasons one of the reasons why this isn't looking right for the shirt is because of the texture coordinates that we're using. And by default, we're using the generated coordinates. So as you see, whenever I drop that in there, it didn't make any change. Well, why is that? It's because it's by default that's what it uses. So if generated is not going to work for us, what about normal? And as we see, that doesn't quite look right either. So another commonly used one is object. Again, it has kind of the same problems as generated for this particular object. And sorry, gotta undo that there. Let's see, if we try object, that's the one we were just looking at. Let's try camera. That's just gonna do whatever it is from the camera view. And as you can see, as you kind of turn around, this seems like it changes just a little bit, and that's not what we want. And if we try a window, well, that's almost the same thing as the camera, just from a slightly different angle, and again, it's not what we want. So it turns out the best one for us to use for something like a shirt is going to be the UV. So if you look here, right here where we have a seam on the shoulder, you can see there's a little variation on the pattern. Right here where the front comes to the back, you have a variation on the shoulder, on the pattern, and it's exactly what you would have within a real shirt. So now that we're looking at this, the next thing that you see that's wrong is that, well, we have the stripes going at an angle. If we're doing something like a tie, this might be exactly what we want to do. But for something like a shirt, we want it to go either horizontal or vertical. So to adjust that, we need to add in a vector mapping node. Now, if you're doing this on an object like a torus or some other object where you're not necessarily going to use the UVs, You might need to adjust more than one of these rotations to get it to do what you want it to do. For example, I was doing an object earlier today and I had to do 45 degrees on both the X and the Y to get it to do what I wanted. But for the UVs, if we use negative 45 on the X, we can get horizontal stripes. And if we use a positive 45 on the y-axis, then we can get on negative 45 on the x gives us the vertical stripes. Positive 45 on the y-axis gives us the horizontal stripes. Now, one thing I will note, especially as we turn up the scale just a little bit so that we can see this in action, sometimes you might notice that your even once we get this into a horizontal stripe, you might notice that that it might not look quite right on one of the objects, on one of the parts like the sleeve. Well, that's easy to fix because you can come over here to the UV image editor and you can rotate you can scale, and you can grab and move and basically change the positioning just by changing the positioning and the rotation or of the part that you're looking at. You can affect the placement of the pattern that you're trying to get. So looking back over at the node editor, now you might notice, looking at the bands here on the shirt, that it goes from a white to a black along a gradient, and then it goes from the black to the white along a gradient, and then just repeats that over and over. Well, that gives it kind of a soft, fuzzy look, and maybe we want our bands to be a little sharper. So we can do that by adding in a converter color ramp. And you can achieve the sharper look by using points that are close together with your markers being close together. You can achieve that look with just about any of these options in here. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to use constant because from the things that I have done as far as testing, as far as trying to do the stripes, it's the simplest to create the stripes, and you don't need as many of the, because it's the simplest because you don't need as many of them. So you can adjust the width of your stripe simply by adjusting the position of the marker along the color ramp. Now, I'll admit that whenever I first did this, I didn't think about the fact that I could use the color ramp itself to create the stripes, the color for the stripes, and so I added in a mix RGB and used the output of the color ramp as the factor, making the bottom color the color for the shirt and the top color the color of the stripe. And you can see for just a single stripe that actually does a pretty nice little job. and you can control how many stripes you have by adjusting the scale. You can go with as few or as many. Well, maybe that's too many. Uh, Whoa. There we go. You can go with as few or as many stripes as you want. Let's drop this back down to around 10. And so that is what works here for this. So to create the shirt that I had in the on my character in the intro, all I did was I duplicated these four nodes with the Control Shift D to maintain the connection to the UV image with the mapping. And I made then if we take this last node and make it the one that connects into the color, there we go. And then we take the color, you wind up doing all sorts of things you don't normally do in a tutorial that you don't normally do. So we'll take the output from the original mix shader and put it into the lower slot on the mix, which if you remember is the basic color of our shirt. We'll change the top color to the color of our stripe. And what happened to our stripe that we had? We had the blue one. Where did it go? Well, it turns out these two are sitting on top of each other. And so we can remedy that just by changing the location of the stripe. Now, I know from experience with this particular, with my previous attempts at doing this tutorial, that if I change this to 0.02, so about 2 centimeters, well, I'm sorry, 0.03. That works to give us an even stripe at this scale. If you want them sitting on top of each other, 0.75, whoops, 0.075, no, 0.0075. One, 0.01. There we go. As you can see, this can be kind of fiddly to get these two positioned so that they're the way that you want them. So this is a variation off of another shirt that I have in my closet. The shirt in my closet actually has blue for the big stripes and white for this other stripe. But we're gonna leave it like that for now. So that's how I originally did it, and as you can see, this can be kind of cumbersome because it's especially if you start adding more and more stripes, because this, adjusting the mapping is really fiddly. It depends on what scale you have and how close together you want your stripes. So that can be a really challenge trying to figure all that out. So I started thinking if there's a way to do this in a way that wasn't so complicated. So I happen to remember that the color ramp actually has the ability to provide your color. So if we change this, so that we have our color, and just like that, now we have our stripe. So what if we want to add in the second stripe? So we add in a couple more markers. We'll take one of them and put it at 0.5, and then we'll take this other one, put it at 0.6, and we'll change the color of this one to the original one. And let's change the color of the other marker to the red stripe down here. Now, the first thing you'll see is that this red stripe is much smaller than the blue stripe. And you'll also notice that the pattern on the shirt now goes from white to red to white to blue to white to red and back to white. So why is it doing that? Well, essentially what it's doing is, if you remember from our wave texture, that's how our gradient went. Our original gradient went from white to black, and then from black to white you went from white to black along a gradient, and went from a gradient from black to white, and it just repeats that over and over. So essentially what it's doing within this color ramp is it's starting over here at white, it's coming over here to the black, and it's coming back over here to white, which means that this is actually going to be bigger than this, because instead of actually being one unit, it's actually doing 2 units of the blue for every 1 unit of the red that it's doing, and it's doing the red on different places. Also, if you notice that it's more of a pattern where it's like A B C B A, where it is where the second half of the pattern is a mirror image of the first half of the pattern. Well, what if we wanted to be able to do something like an ABC ABC pattern? Well, if we wanted to do something like that, what we would probably need over here with our gradient is a gradient that goes from white to black along a gradient, but then when it gets to the black, it jumps right immediately to the white without going through a gradient. And when I was thinking about this, I happened to remember a tutorial from Bartek's Garupa that was the wood tutorial. And in the wood tutorial, this is part of the Shader Forge series, in case you're wondering where to find it. In the Shader Forge series, he put together this node group, and this node group actually gives us exactly what we want. So in case you haven't seen that tutorial, here's that group. It's the modulate group. If you're familiar with that tutorial, it's the modulate group. You can either create it or import it yourself. But if you haven't seen that, what you need is a modulo node, and we're going to set this value down. Let's set it down to like 0.05, and you'll see that it starts to give us a gradient on the shirt that goes from kind of a mid-gray to a black. So what if we want to go from instead of going from a mid-gray, we want it to actually go from a white. So what we can do is we can duplicate this, and we can add in a change this from modulo to divide. And as long as we use the same values for both of these lower elements, then we should get a gradient that goes from white to black. So that gives us our gradient like we want it. But one of the problems with this is to get more and more of these little bands here, we have to go to smaller and smaller numbers. So if we went to, say, for example, 0.01, and again, remembering to do the same thing over here, 0.01, we have to get smaller and smaller numbers to get more and more of these bands. Now, that's not very intuitive. So what if there's a way that we can flip this around so that by getting larger and larger numbers, we get more and more of these numbers instead of getting increasingly smaller numbers? Well, it turns out it's really easy to do if we just duplicate this divide node, and let's plug in the output from the divide node into both of these lower sockets, and we're going to change the top value on the divide node to 1, and then now let's change this to, say, 20, and you see we get the gradient like we had before. And if we change it to, say, 50, we get more of the bands like we want. So the higher we go up with this, the more and more of these little bands we get, and that's exactly what we want to be able to do. And that, in a nutshell, is this node group. So if we disconnect that for just a minute, we'll take this, and we're going to group those together. We're going to take this value and plug it into this lower part of the group input. Let's take the lower value of the group input. We don't want it to go below 0 because we don't want negative numbers. And let's change the name of this to cuts. It gives us some sort of representation of what this value represents. So, like you can think of it as like how many times it's cutting that gradient across the shirt. And then you can exit out of the edit mode of the group and change the group name to modulate. And that is how you set up that node. So if we switch this over to switch that down to a lower number, now what happens whenever we take our color ramp and we plug it in, instantly we have the bands evenly spaced exactly like we want them. And when the bands are the same width within this color ramp, they're going to be the same width over here on the shirt. Now, one of the great things about this setup is you can make this as simple or as complex as you want. I've had some examples of doing this where I had one shirt where I did this, where I had 20 different colors on one shirt. Now that's not something that you would usually do. You'd usually do something a little bit more reasonable. But as you can see, you can make whatever variations on this that you want. And it's super easy. All I'm doing is just I'm pressing E to pick the color swatch, and you can use this to make the bands whatever width you want. You can have them all the same width. You can use them varying widths. You can put spaces between them. You don't even have to put spaces between them if you don't want. So you can make all sorts of variations off of this pattern. So what if instead of and you can go as complex as you want with this, and you can also go as simple as you want. So if we change this one, there we go, change that back to white. Let's bring this down to point 0.1. So if we did like we said with our earlier example and bring this to a minus 45 with the 0 there, and increase our cuts to say something like 200, and just like that we have pinstriping that we could use, like an example of pinstriping like what we could use on a dress shirt or on say a suit. So what if we wanted to do something a little bit more complex, like say a pattern that had stripes that crossed? Well, what we can do is we can just select these three groups, Control Shift D, so that we maintain that UV connection, and let's add in a color RGB mix node. And if we put the color in here, change one of these so that it is the horizontal, and just like that you get a bit of a crossing pattern. Now I think for this particular grouping I liked the multiply a little bit better, and with multiply you want to change that to the factor to 1. So you'll get a little bit of a black spot right here at the crossing pattern, at the crossing point, but that's really not too unusual on a shirt like that anyway. You might see a point like that anyway. So there's that. And whenever you have a shirt like this, you can make all sorts of interesting variations on this. So if you take the idea of doing varied bands with varied thickness and colors, and let's start bringing some of these together. There we go, and let's start changing the colors on some of these. And I'm just going to adjust these with the hue saturation. Can turn that down a little bit. Let's take this one. Let's go for a little bit more of a red, but let's desaturate it just a little. Let's see, this one right here, let's go for more of like a yellow, kind of a bright yellow. We can desaturate just a little bit. And let's see, we'll take one of these. Let's just change it up a little bit. just so we get a little different color pattern going on. And let's see, let's do kind of the same thing here. And you can kind of see we got a little interesting little pattern going on here. So let's take this original, let's take this one color ramp out, and let's hit and Control X to keep that connection there, and we'll do Shift D, connect that in, and instead of multiply, let's switch this back over to mix, but we want to mix it at 50% instead of at 1. And just like that, you can get more of a plaid shirt. So as you can see, just in the few variations that we did right here, this is an extremely flexible shader node setup. You can do whatever you want. One thing I did earlier today or last night was to do this without the UV unwrapping on an object like a torus, and I found that I had to adjust both the rotation for the X and the Y to get it to do what I wanted it to do, but I was able to otherwise use almost exactly the same procedures to create a very similar pattern. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. One of the reasons why I wanted to do a tutorial on striping pattern, and one thing one thing with this setup like this, when you're doing the crossing stripe patterns, is you might want to set up one more node here, and that is to use a value node to connect into the cuts on both elements, and in that way you can adjust both the X and both the horizontal and the vertical stripes at the same time, so that you can maintain an even connection between the two. Now you can always you can make these different numbers if you want, so you don't necessarily have to use this value node, but I find it that most of the time the patterns on a plaid shirt are kind of more of this square type shape. So that's just one thing to keep in mind there. So anyway, one of the reasons why I wanted to do a tutorial on doing stripes is because I was noticing as I was looking at artwork from on the Blender Artist Forum and on other sites like DeviantArt and some other sites, I was noticing that there wasn't really a whole lot of stripe patterns in CG art, and I was wondering why, because whenever you go around in everyday life, they're all over the place. As I said in the intro, I saw a number of striped shirts in my closet, and in the time since I first started thinking about doing this tutorial, and I came up with this technique of doing stripes, I've seen stripes in so many different places and in so many different instances, and so it's a very useful tool to have in your arsenal, I think. It'll help to add a little bit more variety, and I'm interested to see what people can come up with. One thing that I'm sure could probably be done that I haven't figured out yet, that's a variation off of this idea, is kind of a ripple pattern or a zigzag pattern where it's like the lines but they go up and down. So that might be interesting if somebody figures that out and wants to share how they did that. I'd love to see what other people produce with this. So anyway, that is all for this tutorial. If you liked it, if you would feel free to leave a comment, like it, share it, and I look forward to making more tutorials in the future. If there's something that you'd like to learn about, feel free to send me a question, and uh, if you haven't seen it on a tutorial anywhere, we'll see if we can figure out how to do something. And I don't necessarily consider myself an expert user, but I do like sharing what I've learned and some things that are helping me. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time, hopefully in the not too distant future. If you'd like to see more of my artwork, you can check it out at gradypruitt.com. There's not a whole lot of great pieces right now, but I'm hoping to, as this year goes on, to have some more great pieces up there. And because I feel like I'm still kind of learning, but at the same time, like I feel like I'm almost there. So anyway, that's all from me for now. We'll see you next time, and have fun wondering.